Today, I'm going to talk about how everything has been refuted. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. The particular thing that brought to mind that everything has been refuted was yet one more time of somebody telling me that he's looked up some arguments. He looked up I think this was particularly the argument from Contingency Necessity for God's existence, and told me, I looked that up, it's been refuted. And I've seen that many times before. This is just sort of the most recent one that kind of brought this to mind. It's just really funny to me because it was in such a particularly explicit way that he didn't even look at what the refutations are. He just saw that there existed refutations. And it's not like the previous times that I saw it, people actually looked, really familiarized with themselves with the refutations and thought, oh yes, this refutation really is entirely reasonable. This is a genuine problem with the argument. They kind of mostly just paid attention to there being refutations. And I just see tons and tons of references, oh, that's been refuted, without telling me how or why they believe this refutation. And so in this particular context, I point this out, but just generally it's true. Everything's been refuted. The Earth being a globe has been refuted. I mean, the question is not, does a refutation exist? Can you point to somebody who refuted it? Because, it doesn't really matter. Germ theory has been refuted. The efficacy of vaccines has been refuted. The sky being blue has been refuted. It doesn't really matter. I mean, lots and lots and lots of things have been refuted. You can go on and on. And I've seen refutations of the sky is blue. Someone telling me, oh, the sky isn't really blue. It just appears that way because of refraction. Bravo, genius. It's not even refraction, properly speaking. But anyway, that one particularly amuses me. But anyhow, the point being that in all things, it does not matter whether or not one has seen a refutation of an argument or not. What matters is whether the refutation actually succeeds in refuting it. And there are actually, by the way, two senses of refuting an argument can happen basically in two ways. Either one, you can show that one of the premises of the argument is false. I'm sorry, there are three ways. Two, you can show that there is a flaw in the logic of the argument. Or three, you can just straight up show the conclusion of the argument is false. So that suffices to show that there's got to be one of those two problems with the argument, because an argument can't have true premises and be logically sound and arrive at a false conclusion. That's logically valid. You can't do that. Valid means that can't happen. It's the definition of the term. So that suffices to prove that there is a problem in it. Of those three, the last one is obviously the most powerful because it's really the conclusion that you care about. So if you can directly show the conclusion to be false, you have actually advanced the state of knowledge in some useful way of the people talking. Whereas if you merely show that a premise is false or merely show that there is an invalid logical step, you leave the conclusion as simply unknown. So it's not as good. It is, however, more commonly what you can do. And so the point is, if you actually understand, so a refutation of an argument is going to be one of those three things. And that is to say, a refutation of an argument is itself an argument. If you actually understand the argument, you can present the argument. So if you actually understand the refutation for something, you could present it. I mean this, by the way, I'm American. I always say you when I mean one. Just sort of a habit. I've run into problems, actually, with people used to British English where they properly say one instead of you, and thinking I was actually talking about them. So, just to mention. So, now the thing about this is that presenting a refutation of some popular argument is in fact a very useful thing to do, providing, of course, that the people who read it actually understand it. If they don't understand it, you're not really doing them any good, but if they understand it, then they will be able to present it themselves. They will be able to go and describe what is actually wrong with the argument themselves. And so then the person who presented the original argument can then look at their counter argument, and progress can actually be made. So so I suggest, in general, when dealing with people, essentially, if somebody merely references the existence of counter arguments, I actually do recommend the rhetorical thing of pointing out that there exist plenty of counter arguments to all sorts of things that are obviously true. Like, for example, well, maybe saying obviously is a little bit of an overstatement, because it's not precisely obvious that the world is round. I mean, the Greeks were able to figure it out, 2,500 years ago, roughly speaking. But in any event, it takes a little bit of reasoning. It takes a bit of pointing to evidence. If you just sort of look out at the ground, the Earth is either flat or hilly, depending upon where you are. So obvious may be a slight overstatement, but it is commonly accepted that the Earth is round. And if you want to look up the evidence for it, it's pretty straightforward and relatively easy to test. You can see things like the Earth's shadow on the moon is in fact round, etc. So you can even look up how ships disappear over horizon. I mean, most of us have only seen pictures, and if you're willing to admit of pictures, then you can look at pictures of the Earth from things like spaceships. Pictures from, like, say, the International Space Station, etc. Okay. So, actually, depending on where you are in an airplane, you can even see that the horizon is a little bit curved there. So if you've taken an airplane that flies particularly high and there aren't clouds underneath to see, you can actually see a very slight curvature to it. Anyhow, so be that as it may, whichever way exactly you want to take it, the point is, you can find refutations of this. You can find them, but they're just not actually valid refutations. That's the problem, because you can't have a valid refutation if something's true. You could have a valid refutation of an invalid argument to a true conclusion. That can exist. So it is possible. Now, it's going to depend on how you come out on St. Anselm's ontological argument, whether or not you actually hold that this argument does in fact work, or if you take the route that I believe I heard St. Thomas describe. St. Thomas's objection, I believe it's St. Thomas, I'm not sure of that, so cum granum salem, with a grain of salt. That the problem with the ontological argument is you would have to actually be God in order to properly make it work, because in order to actually conceive of that, to which nothing greater can be, you would have to be God. Otherwise, you merely have an abstraction of it that you can't properly reason from. So you could refute an argument to a true conclusion anyway, if you buy that objection to it, at least. So that can exist. But in general, I think this is probably best answered rhetorically. Because, answering it logically is just like... Well, it actually would work rhetorically, come to think of it. I was going to say, answering it logically would just be stating that you are saying that there exists a refutation, but you have not demonstrated that there is a refutation. So if you want me to accept that there is in fact a valid refutation, you must demonstrate this valid refutation. You can't merely claim that it exists. Something along those lines. That actually would not be so much logical. It'd be straightforward and entirely reasonable, but it wouldn't be strictly logical. Strictly logical would be something along the lines of, the argument is in fact true, therefore anything which shows that the argument is sound, therefore anything which claims to refute it must therefore be unsound, and so your supposed refutation is not valid. Perfectly logical, because this is just very simply, since it is impossible to disprove a sound argument, that is, premises are true and the thing is logical, and so the conclusion necessarily follows. It is true, if you have a sound argument, that that something that claims to be a disproof of that must necessarily be flawed. So it'd be entirely logical to simply say that. It cannot actually be a refutation because it is a sound argument. And at that point, the person would have to then actually make their argument. You can also go the even more rhetorical route of just pointing out that there, of course, there are refutations of everything. The mere fact that you found a refutation doesn't mean anything. It only matters if you can actually establish the refutation is sound. Those are both very good. I think those are both basically the ways to respond to this sort of thing. It's kind of amusing when you find it. By the way, just as a side note, when it comes to the argument from contingency and necessity, they tend to fall, because the argument from contingency and necessity is so simple. And being so simple, there can't be many responses to it. So, the argument from contingency, just to make sure we're all on the same page, the argument from contingency and necessity is there exists something which is contingent. It must be dependent, therefore, upon something, contingent on something else. That thing is either contingent or necessary, and so on. And this works in chain. This chain can't go on forever. Otherwise, there would be nothing. There would be unfulfilled contingency, and therefore, you can't have an actual infinite. You can't have an actual infinite regress. And this, by the way, is not backwards in time. This is in the moment. Like, why is there something here now that does not have of its nature to exist? Is not its nature to exist. It must depend upon something else for its existence. You can't have an actual infinite in the moment because it would never end. It's the same reason that you can't have a. No, I'm sorry. I'm actually thinking of why you can't have infinite time. Or time stretching back infinitely far, because you can't have an infinite sequence that terminates. It's a contradiction in terms, and that's what time stretching back infinitely far would mean. It's that you keep on adding numbers, and then finally you hit a biggest number. You've always been adding numbers, but finally you hit a biggest number and stop. You can't do that. You can't have always been falling and suddenly land. It doesn't work because the very nature of a thing being infinite is that you can always add on more, but the nature of being actual is that all of that adding has already happened. And so you can keep on adding more things, but it's all already happened, are opposites to each other. They contradict each other. And so you can't do that. You can't have infinite time. The so-called eternal universe can't actually exist because it's a contradiction in terms. It is having but this is why, incidentally, because this is not an actual infinite. At least if you're not positing the B theory of time, by the way, that holds that time, all moments in time exist simultaneously, and time's an illusion, essentially. But unless you're holding that, then you'd have an actual infinite if the universe were, if time was unending or you had the eternal universe. But otherwise, if you hold the presentist or A theory of time, where only the present moment exists, infinitely many moments of time will not constitute an actual infinity because they're not all actual at the same time. They don't exist at the same time. And so that's why St. Thomas never applied that to temporal sequences. He applied them to immediate sequences. You can't have an actual infinity. You can have an infinite regress in the moment, because there's no time to have that regress, and you can't keep on going back without ever stopping right now where they all exist, but you can keep on adding more. Well, you can't add more because you're in the moment. There's no time in which to add the more. So you can't have an actual infinite in that fashion, because actual and infinite are contradictories to each other. You can't have the infinite time for the simple, for a somewhat different reason. So I want to distinguish those two sorts of infinite regress that you can't have. You can't have the other infinite regress because for them all to have happened, it's a confusion to look backwards in time and think it can proceed, because it's not. It's receding. Proceeding goes the other direction. That's the problem. It's having an infinite sequence with the last element is the basic problem of time that has always been, but now we're in the moment, and so that infinite sequence has ended now in the wrong direction. So that's the distinction between those two things, to help shed light on why you can't have an actual infinite. It's distinct from the whole temporal thing, which is a sequence of events. Now, so that's, I'm sorry. So there must be something that is not contingent, but in fact necessary. Otherwise, all of these contingency would not exist, because it would all be contingent on nothing, and nothing can't give it being, so it wouldn't be there. So that would be a contradiction, so therefore there is something necessary. That necessary thing is God, what all men call God. Or this all men call God is I think the usual translation of it. Okay, by the way, there's a lot of additional pages beyond this to establish this proof from natural theology as to why God has properties typically ascribed to God. This is the starting point, not the ending point. I've seen that come up, but anyway, so point being that the refutations of that argument, because this is a very simple argument if you don't go into the digressions to clarify things the way that I did, it's just very simply, there is something that is contingent. The thing that it is contingent upon must either be contingent or not, and so on. You can't have an actual infinite, and therefore there must be a necessary thing on which this depends. So, ways you can challenge this, because it is such a simple argument. You can question whether or not there's anything contingent, but this is stupid. I mean, the only way to do that is to not understand what contingency is, because just look at things and they don't all, they're not the same throughout time, therefore they are not necessary in that fashion. Okay, so there's that. Some people will try to get around this by not understanding the argument, saying that, like, you have to I've seen people saying, like, you have to prove that the universe itself is contingent. No, you don't. Not necessary for this argument at all. There are some things you can try to do to get around this, hoping that there might be multiple necessary things, but the problem, if you try to go that route, and by and large no one does, but then the things that are contingent on different necessary things wouldn't interact with each other in any way. So if things actually interact with each other, they have to be dependent upon the same necessity. Okay, the same ultimate necessity. Okay, no one brings that one up anyway, though. Okay, the other things, basically, generally speaking, the way that people tend to attack it, other than that, because it's the only really other part of it, is attacking that you can't have an actual infinite. And the only way to hold that you can't have an actual, to hold that, well, maybe we can have an actual infinite, is basically to hold that reason doesn't work. No one ever phrases it that way, because that would be poor salesmanship, but that's what it always amounts to. So what you have to actually do in practice is go through their particular variant of how they're saying that reason doesn't actually work, and then work out the fact that what they're actually saying is that reason doesn't actually work, and then they'll admit it. Sometimes they won't. They'll get to the point where, like, clearly this is true, and then they don't care. And they'll just sort of change subjects, or they will admit it. Yeah, okay, reason doesn't work. Usually some variant of reason doesn't work when talking about things outside of our experience, but it works well enough to build iPhones, which is all I care about. I don't know why the iPhone is always so popular in these arguments. It's like there's some sort of atheist ontology for the iPhone, that the purpose of reason is specifically the iPhone, not technology in general. I don't really understand it. I just saw iPhone stuff coming up so often. I'm assuming that's not universal, and just for whatever reason, I, by happenstance, happen to have seen them always being about iPhones, and maybe once or twice about the computer you're typing on or something. But anyway, but yeah, so, like, reason works well enough for practical things. It's good enough for engineering, and that's all that really matters. But it's not good enough for anything beyond that. So if it's outside of our experience and isn't tested by engineering, then reason doesn't work. But it does work for engineering, which most of the people never are engineers, curiously. But side note, not important here. Usually that's how it goes. This is what these refutations will look like. They always look like some variant of this, because there are only so many places you can attack this. So occasionally, by the way, you will, sometimes you will, people attack you can't have an actual infinite by trying to say that you don't have an actual infinite because, or you can have an actual infinite by trying to say you can have this infinite temporal sequence. You can't in any event, but it doesn't matter. St. Thomas never attacked St. Thomas and his contemporaries never attacked an infinite sequence of time. They always attacked things either, like in the argument for motion, from one moment changing into the next, or the argument in contingency necessity is within the moment. They never went temporally because they didn't want to take on infinite sequences of time. So there will be that misunderstanding of what the argument is sometimes. And there will, of course, be other misunderstandings of what the argument is. But so it's kind of, it's one of those three things. It's either question contingency, mostly because they don't understand what contingency means. attacking that you can't have an actual infinite, sometimes just declaring that human reason doesn't work for that. And the problem, of course, is if somebody denies human reason, you're done. There's literally nothing to do, because you can't produce. It would be circular and useless to produce a reasonable argument that reason works, because you're just relying on the reason that is in question. And that's why you either have to simply accept on the basis of direct perception that reason works, or reject that reason works. Those are your two options. You can't prove it, because all proof is necessarily reasonable and therefore circular. Proof of reason, proof that proofs work is intrinsically circular, because it's a proof that's proving it. In the same way that you can't, you can't look at something to prove that what you see is what you see, because it's circular. You're invoking the thing to defend itself. These things fall under the realm of direct perception. I don't mean, by the way, that there's no alternative ways of verifying things that you perceive by sight. There are alternative ways of verifying things that you perceive by sight. What I'm saying is that you see something. You can't verify by seeing it. That the proof of seeing it doesn't work as that proof, because it is the thing itself. You either accept that you see it, or you don't accept that you see it. You can verify the correspondence of your vision to the thing perceived. I'm sorry, it was overly technical as an example. Too much modern philosophy, capital M, modern philosophy, that had to do with some technicalities about the nature of sense perception and the distinction between subjective perception and or qualia and the thing itself. And I was talking about how you can't use qualia to prove qualia, not stepping outside of it. Anyway, sorry about that. Not a well-chosen example there. Anyway, so the point being that that's what the refutations all amount to, because they all have to be one of these things. To be a refutation of something, you have to attack it, or a straw man. So you can always make up something that the argument isn't and attack that instead, of course. So it's either attacking something that the argument isn't necessity, but that's just a misunderstanding, or contingency, but that's just a misunderstanding of what contingency is. Because the funny thing about this is this argument is itself, the words that form the argument are themselves contingent, because there are multiple words that are not each other, that the word, contingent and the word are not the same word. They don't share the same substance. The one can exist without the other, and so on. So the argument itself is a contingent thing. And in point of fact, Descartes actually, in Meditations on First Philosophy, which was his second book, where he developed his infamous argument for the existence of God, which I think he used the nothing greater than can be thought one. Didn't do a great job of it in... I can't remember the name of his earlier, shorter work. But then in Meditations on First Philosophy, he expanded it and improved it a bit. But then he sort of said, okay, but if you don't... I mean, he didn't say this. This is not a direct quote or even a close paraphrase, but essentially, okay, but if you don't buy that, here's the argument from Contingency Necessity. And my thoughts, since I have multiple thoughts and these thoughts are not the same, they don't depend upon each other, that's sufficient to establish there is something contingent, and therefore we can just use the argument from Contingency Necessity. So the funny thing about the argument from Contingency Necessity is that it, in fact, depends upon itself. It can depend upon itself. I mean, it works equally well if you apply it to spoons or anything else. In our ordinary experience, because these things are all contingent. They're very clearly contingent. If you pay even the slightest bit of attention and know what contingency is. But you don't need any of them. You can be a brain in a jar. You could be in the Matrix and apply the argument from Contingency Necessity, because, well, the argument itself, that you are thinking about the argument is itself a contingent thing, and therefore you can establish the existence of a contingent thing, and, well, away you go, because you're almost there already. So, yeah. It's just kind of a funny thing. Most arguments rely on premises that are outside of themselves. This one, the fact that there are multiple premises in the argument is all you really need to satisfy to prove that the first premise is actually true. So anyway, a little nerd humor, I suppose. But yeah, that's how these things all get attacked. So the thing about it is that you don't really need to go and read up on whoever's thing, because they don't have some startling insight. They can only attack it in one of a small number of ways, and it's not really hard to present the small number of ways it is possible to attack this. I mean, I guess you could have an incredibly complicated straw man, but so if you just require the person to actually present it, it won't be hard to deal with. The only downside to that, and this kind of gets a little bit to a previous video of mine on the trouble with rhetorical arguments, is they may well have encountered an objection to it rather than attacking it in any sort of logical way, is instead a purely rhetorical attack on it. And the problem with that is, unless they can present the rhetoric, they will not feel like they can present the argument, because it isn't really an argument per se, it's just rhetoric. It's illogical rhetoric. And if you can't capture that illogical rhetoric, then the problem is they will think you don't understand the argument, because the only thing that appeals to them is the rhetoric in it, not the logic. See my previous video. So there, you unfortunately sometimes, if you are trying to help a person, you have reason to think they're actually going to stick with this long enough to, listen to you. You may be stuck looking up the refutation and then seeing what is the rhetorical strength in it, and then coming up with counter rhetoric that will help the person out of the rhetoric. Now, the thing about counter rhetoric is the counter rhetoric basically it just tends to neutralize. It's like, if you've got a strong acid, you throw a strong base into it, you get a lot of heat, and sometimes a bit of an explosion. Or frothing or what have you, but then it neutralizes out and it's neither acidic nor basic, assuming you got the one thing to match the other. And at that point, you now have something that is more neutral, and you can then proceed with something productive. So that's how it goes with rhetoric and counter rhetoric. So if a person has not an objection to this, then not a logical objection to this, but a rhetorical objection to it, then the thing to do is you're going to have to see what the rhetoric is and then generate some counter rhetoric so that you can clear the air so that thinking can actually proceed. Or logical thinking can actually proceed, is what I meant. The other thing is, if a person does take refuge in logic, or reason doesn't work, human rationality does not work, it can't know truth, it can't get to ultimate truths, it's only good for iPhones, and that's it. Then the problem there in a person staking out an explicitly irrational position is that at this point you cannot help them with rational thinking, because declaring that reason doesn't work is a universal defeater. You can defeat literally any argument whatsoever if you simply say logic doesn't actually work. Because at that point there cannot be an argument that to which the answer logic doesn't work doesn't defeat it. So again, this is basically, well, frankly, again, just putting a person in the place of the only thing that is going to work is rhetoric, because at that point, you're going to need to sway them. The thing is, even rhetoric isn't going to be very successful, though, if a person really is going to stake out this position, because no matter how much you sway them by rhetoric, they'll be able to find counter rhetoric. The bigger thing that needs to happen, and this is probably something that only they can do, one of those things like, the famous, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. Same thing. If they stake out their position that reason doesn't work, which is the ultimate universal defeater, like, at the end of the day, if you're going to lose no matter what, you can just say, aha, I reject argumentation. Well, okay. The argument clearly will not work then. But it's a really bad place to be, and they need to get out of that place. So the thing there that I recommend is to try to, and this is somebody that you actually spend enough time with that you have some hope of doing this, because it's only going to work over time, is to present essentially the problem with being irrational to them over time, because they will want to act rationally, and you will need to constantly remind them that their position is that reason doesn't actually work all of the times they try to invoke reason. And so you need to essentially just keep on reminding them of their conclusion until they decide whether, truly make a final decision as to whether or not they like this conclusion or not. Once did that with a friend who questioned whether or not, it was something along the lines of saying that the only accounts of the thing were by people who believed that it actually happened. And so I started pointing out to him all of the times he talked about events, pointing out that, like, the only people who ever talk about the Large Hadron Collider are people who believe the Large Hadron Collider exists. So, like, clearly it doesn't. And, the only people who describe France are people who believe there's a France. And on, and he got really, really sick of it. And then I backed it. Like, once the point really got made, I backed off of it. This gets to a general thing. Don't require somebody to actually admit that they're wrong. Once they realize it, stop. Don't. It's the saying. It's analogous to don't sell past the close. If you're familiar with persuasion in a selling context, but essentially, like, don't require somebody to admit that you're right because they won't want to do it. It's not even about saving face most of the time. It can be, but most of the time it's because it's too final. To make this sort of thing, to admit, okay, I was wrong, is to really truly commit yourself to something, and they're not comfortable with it. Once they realize that it's wrong, they're not comfortable with it being wrong yet. They need some time, they need to sleep on it, as it were. And that's why you always once they realize it, don't make them admit it, because it's making them admit it is too final. Back off at that point. Let them rest in the knowledge that the thing they had thought was true is false, and then they will eventually come to act on it being false. They may not even at that point remember that they were wrong, or remember that you're the one who helped them, or whatever. And here I'd like, it's a quote, has a lot of different forms. I like Ronald Reagan's version of it, or the version I heard attributed to Ronald Reagan. That there is no limit to what a man can achieve so long as he doesn't care who gets the credit for it. And so you can persuade people vastly better as long as you don't care whether or not you get the credit for having persuaded them of it. And so, the most effective technique is once they realize it's wrong, stop, and then let them come to sort of own it. And they may very well forget that it ever came from you, or that you had anything to do with this. They may not even notice in the time, because they will only sort of come to think of it as wrong, and they will remember their own thoughts on it, not how you led them up to it. And you know what? That's okay, because what matters is them knowing the truth, not you getting the credit for it. So that's why you should always stop before you require somebody to admit that you're right, because you'll fail far more often if you want them to admit that you're right. And if you just let them rest in that and come to terms with the truth, they will be much more likely to take those final steps. So yeah, that's just how to deal with that, and very important part of don't make them admit it. Just stop once they get it, and then let them make it their own. And much more effective. So, yeah. Various things about refutations and how you can find a refutation to everything, and the refutation, the invalid refutations that come to mind because I've seen them so often being used primarily here as an example. Plus, it's as good a place as any to talk about them. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.